Uh, this is an interview of Dale R. Dexheimer. That's me doing my own interview. I was born March 23rd, 1940, served in the United States Navy, and I was in from 63 until 67. I attained the rank of Lieutenant Junior Grade 02. This recording is being done in Burleson, Texas on Friday, May the 7th, 2010. Also in the room are Gary Burton and Milton Gibson. They're taking care of the audio and video. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. As I've just stated, my name is Dale Dexheimer. I was born in Frenchtown, New Jersey, March of 1940. In my interview, like so many other folks, I'm one of those guys that went and did my time in the U.S. military, and I didn't really do anything for those 3.5 years. I was just in there doing my time. And actually, that's a story I hear from a lot of veterans, but we all have a story to tell, so this is mine. As I say, I was born in March of 1940, Frenchtown, New Jersey. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania on what was a dairy farm. I remember we had cows in the barn until, probably 1946, right after the war. But somewhere in the early 60s, the farm hasn't been farmed since. But anyway, it was a rural area that I grew up in. Didn't know anything about the ocean or ships or any of that stuff. But I went to high school there in eastern Pennsylvania. Ended up with a BS in secondary education from East Stroudsburg State in Pennsylvania. I taught for 1 year. I taught for 1 year in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, and in that 1 year I found that I had very little patience. I was 22, 23 years old, teaching junior high history, and like I say, I didn't have any patience, and I thought the best thing for me to do, I could go down and I could enlist. I had a teacher's deferment, but I thought the thing to do, why don't I spend 3 or 4 years in the military, and that would give me some background and decide what I wanted to do with my life. So in May of 1963, I trundled off to Philadelphia and talked to the Navy recruiter, got myself into officer candidate school. To me, the Navy was a better choice. I didn't really think the Army was all that good. Something about laying in the dirt, bugs and people shooting at you and stuff like that didn't seem the way to go. I had a favorite uncle who had been in the Navy, and to me it was just a better choice. So I ended up in the Navy. As I say, I taught for that 1 year in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, went to OCS in October of '63. I reported Officer Candidate School, Newport, Rhode Island, reported on a Sunday. And as I remember, they put us in the barracks, said this is where you're going to be for the next 16 weeks. But on that very first afternoon, we were out on the grinder learning a little close order drill. We did like 2 hours close order drill the first day we were there. And that close order drill was one of those things that you got pretty proficient at. We did a lot of close order drill. We were housed in World War II barracks. It was we were in the last class that lived in those World War II barracks. One of the neat things about being Rhode Island in the wintertime, in a barracks that the wind came around the windows and around the doors. There were any number of mornings that we would wake up and there would be snow on the floor and snow on your rack where it came around the windows and what have you. And it was a little chilly, but we had a good time. OCS was a 16-week program. The first 8 weeks on Monday through Friday, we had classes all day, and there was some drill thrown in there. Everywhere we went, we marched as a unit. Had a weekly pass and review, a little parade for the powers that be, classes, and you know, all these schools you go to, you get some sort of an annual, and I can't find mine, so I'm a little hazy on what we really did, but we had classes in seamanship, leadership, engineering, gunnery, military justice, bunch of things, and I can't remember what they all were, but we marched to class, we marched from class, and somehow that chief that was our boss, he always found probably an hour in the day somewhere where we could go out on the parade ground and just march so we could get a little better at it. Just a matter of discipline, really. And being in the military, discipline, when somebody says go left, you better go left. When they say go right, you go right. And they put you out on that parade ground, by golly, and you learn when the man barks an order, that's what you do. OCS really was 2 8-week periods. The first 8 weeks was critical because at the end of the first 8-week period, you had 3 options, depending upon your grades, the first 8 weeks. Number 1, you could go on and enter the second 8 weeks. Number 2, if you weren't quite so stout, you could roll back and start all over. Or number 3, if you weren't very proficient at all, they would just ship you off to the regular Navy where you could start as a seaman deuce and you could spend your 2 years in the Navy and then go back and be a civilian. I guess I was fortunate enough I got the first option. I went on with the second 8 weeks in February of '64. Got my gold bar. I was commissioned an ensign in the Navy. I've talked about this marching, etc. The second 8 weeks, there were some advantages to being good at marching. We had this weekly pass and review, this parade, and I was lucky enough to be in the color company, the color section, which meant we were pretty good at being out there on the parade ground. Maybe we couldn't do anything else, but we could march. The reward in the second 8 weeks, you got a little extra liberty if you marched well. So we got some extra time off. But things I remember in that second 8 weeks, to me, the biggest thing in being in the military was the camaraderie. But I can remember in 1964, of course, I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania, so when I got liberty, if I got a whole weekend, I'd hop in the car and I'd run home to Pennsylvania. It wasn't but 5-6 hours down the highway. But I would always get some riders and drop them off somewhere in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, wherever. But I can remember going down I-95 with 4 other guys in a car. You know, we're all in our early 20s. Had a '59 Ford. 5 of us in there with the Beatles just as loud as we could have them on the radio, and we were just having a good time. You remember a lot of those people. Anyway, I got my commission in February of '64, and I reported to USS Soley DD-707 in Norfolk, Virginia. Soley was a Sumner-class destroyer. There were just, I don't know how many thousand the United States built during the Second World War. But she was, the keel was laid in '43 or '44. She was an old girl. She'd had a lot of service. And I spent, I don't know, it was only 5 or 6 weeks on Soley, and then they decommissioned her. So I got orders to USS Willard Keith, DD-775. The good thing about being on Soley for those 4 or 5 weeks, it's the first time I'd ever been to sea. They put me on this big gray thing, got a number up on the front, says 707, so you make sure you get on the right one. And when I got on, they didn't have enough room in officers' quarters for me, so I got to bunk in chief's quarters, which on a destroyer is all the way up forward. So when you get in a rough sea, when you go over that wave, there's a fulcrum on that ship, and when she gets to the top of the wave, the bow comes slam. And they put me up in chief's quarters that first time I ever went to sea. We were only out for 4 or 5 days, but It didn't take very long, and for a guy that grew up on a farm, how come this thing keeps rocking and moving? Why don't it stop? I didn't get seasick, but I got real lucky because right above my bunk there was a hatch that went outside. It was the main deck. And when I started to get sick, I would undog that hatch and I could stick my head up there. It was a hatch, I don't know, 18, 20 inches, something like that. But I could stick my head and my shoulders up through there and suck in that good Atlantic air, and that would clear your head, clear your stomach, etc. I'd dog the hatch, go back down there and do whatever was going on. So I didn't stay on that ship very long, but when I went over to Willard Keith, boy, I'd been on a ship for 6 weeks. I knew the bow was that part up in the front, and the stern was in the back. I knew there was port to the left, starboard to the right. I knew some things that when I went on, the old man must have thought, gee whiz, this kid happens to know what's going on. So that always stood me in good stead. But when I went over to the Willard Keith, she was the same class, the same age. On the Keith, I was communications officer. And one of the first things, I only ever went to one school after I was commissioned. I went to Registered Publication System School. The old man, the captain, had to get me a waiver to go to school because I didn't have enough active time. You were supposed to have at least 6 months active service. I had like 6 weeks. But nobody in that wardroom wanted to be a registered publication custodian. He was the guy that kept all of the confidential, secret, top secret. You had all of the safes, all of the codes, all of that stuff that was, all of that stuff could get you in a lot of trouble, was my responsibility. Nobody else wanted to do it, so the old man got me a waiver so I could go off to school and learn how to handle this stuff. And for the 3.5 years that I was active, I was always a registered publication custodian. I'm not sure it was as bad as most people made it. You just had to, it was a discipline thing. You had to watch your P's and Q's. You couldn't let paper be out there floating around. You know, the Cold War was going on, and we were worried about the Russians and all those people getting all our secrets, but I went off to RPS school. Couple things about the Willard Keith. When I got on, I had just come off a destroyer that was decommissioned, and the Keith had just gone from regular Navy to a reserve training ship. But we had a skeleton crew, and we could get the ship underway, we could operate the ship, but we had a reserve crew in the Norfolk area, and on weekends, the one weekend a month that reservists do their training, they would come on board, we'd get underway on a Saturday morning, we'd go out and we'd steam around for a day and a half and come back in. It was training for those guys. In addition to their regular weekends, we had reserve units from all over the country would come and they would train on us. The 2 weeks training that reservists get in the summertime, or whenever they go, they would come and they'd get on board and we'd take them out and we'd train them for a couple weeks. So normally, we got underway on a Monday morning. We'd go out in the Atlantic and we'd chase around. We'd do some aerial gunnery, we'd do some surface gunnery, we'd do some ASW, anti-submarine warfare stuff. And normally we would probably head toward the Caribbean, particularly in the wintertime. So we'd end up down there on a Friday afternoon. We'd we'd spend the weekend in Puerto Rico, Jamaica. We'd go to Kingston or Montego Bay. We went to some half-decent places for the weekend. And there were always Americans in these places that were happy to see young naval officers, and they would have parties, and it was a pretty good deal when you get right down to it. We'd spend a weekend in one of those ports. We'd get underway from that port on Monday morning, fool around coming back home, and Friday afternoon we'd end up back in Norfolk. Saturday morning we'd dump those reservists off. We'd normally have a couple weeks in port, and then we'd have another group come on board. So that's what we did. Went to Gitmo a number of times, Guantanamo. I hear all these prisoners complaining about how tough it is. To me, Gitmo wasn't all that bad. It was always nice and warm. There was always a trade wind. That end of Cuba was really very dry. but there were palm trees and all that stuff. You didn't have to worry about snow and bad weather. Things that we would do. If I would have known it was just going to be you two, you see, I would have brought some pictures, man, action shots. Yeah. Anyway, resuming, things that we would normally do, pretty much what any young junior officer does. Stand watches on these 2-week forays. We would go to general quarters at least once a day. Every time you shot or this anti-submarine exercises, etc., we'd go to general quarters. I've got a couple items here that I remembered as specifics. You know, those things that we remember from 45 and 50 years ago. We had one time, I don't remember what year it was, but we had an exercise that we went out off the Virginia Capes and we did an anti-submarine warfare deal. It was a barrier patrol. We had, I don't know, 5, 6, maybe 8 destroyers lined up in a line, and the submarines were farther out and they were supposed to penetrate us as though they were going to go into Norfolk or some such thing. They were going to shoot missiles, whatever they were going to do. We were supposed to catch them. We weren't real good at that, but nonetheless, we were out there trying. But on this particular time, we went out on this barrier patrol, and it was pretty darn rough out there. It's just north of Cape Hatteras. And for 4 days, that old tin can, she rolled 55 degrees one way, and then she'd turn around, she'd come back, and she'd roll 55 the other way. We had a thing called an inclinometer, which was basically a pendulum, hung up on a forward bulkhead. And of course, it just hung straight down and the ship moved under it. It was free swinging. And you could watch, and that would go over to 55, then she'd come down and swing the other way. 45, of course, is halfway, so at 55 degrees, it was easier to walk on the bulkhead. It was easier to walk on the wall than it was on the deck. And you do that for 4 days, and we had some sick puppies on board. Guys who had been there for a while. It's just constant. There's no way to get away from it. You really get tired. We would go down and like all small ships, we had bunk straps. And when you got up in a rack, you had 3 straps. It was a canvas strap, a couple inches wide. You strapped down on your calf, and you strapped your midsection, you strapped your chest. And if you were going to stay in a rack, that's the way you did it, because if you didn't have a bunk strap, when she rolled, you went out of the rack. So that was one little story. A second story, we were somewhere in the Caribbean, and we were coming back to Norfolk. We had 2 destroyers, ourselves and somebody else was with us. We were in company. We're just steaming along doing whatever we do. And we picked up an unidentified submarine. Sonar guys must have been real shifty that day, and they picked up this unident. So, okay, who is this guy? So we fool around, we chase this guy for a little bit. Reported back to Norfolk to whoever we reported to, and they chopped us. They changed our operational, who we reported to, and they chopped us to ASW Forland, Anti-Submarine Warfare Forces Atlantic, which made us a regular Navy, and we're chasing this guy, and nobody seems to know who he is. They sent out airplanes, and we had the 2 tin cans, and we chased that guy for 2 days. It's an interesting process. You know, there's a procedure to do all this stuff, and you chase them. And of course, this is 45 years ago. What they do today, you know, they probably got some super secret. They punch a computer and takes care of everything, but we did it the old-fashioned way. But we chased him for 2 days, and after 2 days, to this day, I don't know if he was our nuclear submarine or a Russian or who he belonged to. Never did find out who he belonged to. But after 2 days, in my mind, he got tired of fooling around. He said, well, I've played with you guys for 2 days. That's enough of that stuff. And I remember distinctly when we lost him, he set his course on 090, due east, and he cranked that sucker up to about 27 knots. Underwater, we never did see him. He cranked her up and he said, "See ya," and he was gone. And with the ship that I was on, with 2 boilers on the line, which was pretty much normal operating, he just walked away from us at 27 knots. He said, "I'm tired of playing with you guys." So how much of that went on back then in Cold War years? You know, it was a cat and mouse game. But it was interesting stuff. And it was, you know, we're in a real war here. We're really chasing a guy. It wasn't just training. It was a fun deal, really. The third item I remembered here that I thought was kind of interesting. We went out and we worked with carrier groups a couple times. And the one thing I remember about working with carrier groups, in all these carrier groups, you have the carrier in the center and then you got a bunch of small boys around him and the screen to keep him safe, pick up guys that have to bail out, this, that, and the other thing. But there's one ship in there, there's a destroyer that is in a plane guard position. Plane guard, you sit 500 yards off the stern of that bird farm. And the idea is you're back there, and if one of their pilots ditches, you're supposed to catch him. The thing that was really neat, we did this at night, and we did it when the seas were pretty rough. Now, we're only 500 yards behind that carrier, and 500 yards when you're out there is not all that far. You think, you know, it's 5 football fields. But the seas were pretty rough, and you could look, and we could see the back of the flight deck. And you could see it would roll as the ship rolled. You know, it goes this way, and it goes up, and it goes down. And here come these, they had some S2Fs, which was a twin-engine propeller plane. And those guys, the relative speed, by the time they take the ship and the wind and everything, those guys, they almost flew over the carrier and just landed. But then we had these F4 guys, and I don't know what they landed those jets at, but they were a lot quicker. But it's black. There are lights on a carrier. You can see the lights and what have you. But the deck's doing this. And here comes this dude with his Phantom, and they all made it. It always just amazed me how those guys could do that. And of course, you're just scared to death and didn't want one of them to go awry and us have to pick him up. He may be swimming a long time if we had to pick him up, but it was really an interesting deal to watch those guys and the coordination, whatever it was that those Navy flyers had. Man, they were smooth dudes. Anyway, after, let's see, where are we here? I got married. I got married as a 6-month ensign. Couple things about the Willard Keith. I'll come back to that being married, but we had a good wardroom. The guys got along great on weekends. We had a good time, parties and what have you. I remember all the skippers I ever had. That first ship I went on, USS Soli, we had a ship, a captain. He was a full commander. His name was Harmon. His nickname was Ace. I don't remember what his real name was, but Ace Harmon. I was a 24-year-old ensign, and he was probably 38 or 40, but to me, when they talk about the old man, he was the old man. He had all that sea knowledge and what have you. Went from him on the Keith, we had Captain Bradley. Our XO was a guy named McDaniel. He was a big, jolly guy, and he was just like, he was the guy you went to when you had some trouble, but he was the exec of the ship. I remember lots of guys in that wardroom, and I go on, but I guess it just takes a lot of time. Anyway, let me go back to being a newlywed. I got 2 stories about being a newlywed in the Navy. We got married in 1964, August, late August. Had a week's leave, and after that week, we went back to Norfolk, and we got in Norfolk just in time for the tail end of a hurricane. It was raining cats and dogs. Water curb to curb in the streets. And of course, being 2 kids with no money, me in the service, my wife was a teacher, and she had a job already lined up, but we get back to Norfolk. We're living in a furnished apartment. And when you live in a furnished apartment, let me tell you, that furniture, seen better days, generally speaking. But we live in this furnished apartment. We're newlyweds. But 2 things I remember. One, as newlyweds, you know, you have a few misunderstandings here and there, but I remember one day, it had to be a Friday night or a Saturday, but the wife and I had a little spat. Well, I was on a destroyer and she was tied up at a pier not a mile and a half away, so rather than put up with that wife and have to put up with her, I don't have to put up with this. I'll just go stay on a ship this weekend. I walked out that door and slammed the door, walked out and it was raining cats and dogs. I still had that old black 59 Ford. Raining cats and dogs, I get out there and I reach in my pocket for the keys to that Ford. Damn, no key. So, you know, soaking wet, you turn around, walk back up, and knock, knock, knock. Of course, by the time she opened the door, I was soaking wet. We had a big laugh about it. She let me back in and everything was fine. But it's one of those funny stories you'll remember. While we were in the same apartment, probably a couple months later, we must have had a little trouble adjusting. But a couple months later, it was her turn. She wasn't going to put up with me, and she was going to go home to her mother in Pennsylvania. So she goes out the door and she hops in her old 63 VW Beetle. She fired that puppy up and went down the road. Well, to get back to Pennsylvania, you had to cross the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. The toll at that time was $8. She roars up to the toll gate, stops, didn't have any money. So she turned around, came back. And just like I, knock, knock, knock on the door, there she is, knock, knock, knock on the door. Didn't have any money, had to come back. So we had those two little things that I just always remember. It was a long time ago, but funny stories. At least they are now. They weren't very funny then. Summer of 1965, I got orders to LST 603, landing ship tank, big old shoebox. USS Coconino County. Again, she was a World War II LST. Vietnam was heating up and the Navy was just recommissioning, taking all these ships out of mothballs, and that's what Coconino County was. To me, coming off a ship that would make in excess of 30 knots, you know, a ship that was capable of running 40 miles an hour, I get on this LST and those 2,000 horsepower Jimmies that we had, they're diesel powered, those 1,000 horsepower Jimmies would rocket us along at all of 9 knots. Boy, it was exciting. It wasn't really exciting. It was a different kind of Navy. Anyway, we were in the yard, New York ship in Camden, New Jersey, the winter of 1965-66. Recommissioned at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Must have been February or March of '66. We were there for another 3 or 4 days, and then we were going to fire up. We were going to go out in the Atlantic, down to Virginia, pick up the rest of our crew, and then we were going to go down, and we're going to end up in Southeast Asia. Well, we're steaming down the Delaware River from Philadelphia. First day we were ever underway. We went less than 100 miles, and one of those Jimmies decided, nope, we're not running no more, so blew an engine, had to turn around and go back to the yard. First day. Kind of makes you wonder what's going to happen. But they fixed that engine, gave us a new one, whatever they did. We were underway. We went down to Little Creek, Virginia, where we picked up the rest of the crew. Different thing on an LST. You know, in the Navy, the basic teaching is you do not run into the land. You avoid running into the land. That's not a good thing. On an LST, no, you were supposed to run into the land. And I remember pretty distinctly the first time we ever ran her up on the beach, it was, you know, you ballast everything, you pump water in one area and pump water out of another area, and you get the bottom of the ship equivalent to the gradient of the beach you're going to go up on. You run her up there and open the bow doors, put the ramp down, and the tanks, trucks, Marines, whatever you have, they just run out the front end. But that first time you do it, you're thinking, nah, this is not what we're supposed to be. You know, this is kind of like being in a demolition derby, man. We're not supposed to be doing this. But we did it. We did it all the time. We went from Little Creek, we went down to Charleston, South Carolina, where we stopped for a day or two and picked up a landing craft utility, put it on the main deck. LCUs were, they were landing craft. This vessel was probably 30 feet wide, 60 feet long, and it was up on our main deck. And it was just strapped down, and it rode all the way to Saigon with us. Left Charleston, we went down, we went through the Panama Canal, and to me that was a pretty interesting deal, going through the canal. You get in the lock, and the canal runs north and south. It's actually a north and south waterway between the Atlantic and Pacific. You get in this lock, and in the lock next to you, there was maybe a freighter, and of course he's sitting way up here when you start. They let the water out, he comes down. Of course, in our case, we wanted to go up the lock, so they're pumping water in, and we keep going up. So you have these two ships, and relative, they just pass each other. And it was just a neat experience. You know, they have cruise ships and what have you go through the canal now, but it was an interesting ride. The other interesting thing about going through the Panama Canal, it was sort of tradition back then. When you got to the southern terminus, I think the city is Colon, Panama, but there's a great high bridge that goes across the canal there. And the Panamanians, being our good neighbors and our allies that they were, it was real exciting for them. They would stand up there on that bridge, and they liked to pee on all the Navy ships that went under. It was just one of those exciting things you get to put up with. From the canal, we went up to San Diego, spent a little time there, and then we went up to Camp Pendleton, California. We picked up the first Marine armored that ever went to Nam. We took with us. I don't remember exactly what the units were, but we went into Pendleton in the middle of the night, no lights on the beach we went up on. We beached, and we're there in the middle of the night. It's dark, no smoking, no nothing. And all of a sudden, way out there, it's kind of like watching TV or going to a movie. You can hear those tanks. You can hear them coming. Clackety, clackety, clack. You can hear the tracks. Then the ship moves a little bit. You see little lights up forward where they're putting them on, chain them down, closed everything up, went back out the channel, no lights, the whole thing, and we had those guys on board, and like I say, they went all the way to Saigon with us. From Pendleton, we went to Pearl Harbor, 2 days in Pearl, then we went on to Guam. We were home ported in Guam. It took us like 46 days to go across the Pacific. At 8 or 9 knots, the old girl was just chug, 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 chug. You know, boats on the lake go faster than we were going. And a neat thing about being diesel powered, if the wind was from behind you, if it was from behind you and we're going 8 or 9 miles an hour, if the wind was 8 or 9 miles an hour, you had 2 diesel stacks about that big around, and they poured all that diesel out right on the bridge, and you could stand there for hour after hour and just suck in those good diesel fumes. It was fun. Anyway, after we left, after we were Guam a short period of time, we went on through the Philippines and ended up at Vung Tau, Vietnam, late November of '66. One thing I remember about going through the Philippines, Vietnam was heating up at the time, and after we were out for a couple days, every morning you could see the B-52s. They were coming out of Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and they were, you know, way up there, 30,000, 35,000, wherever they were. But you would see them. Every morning they would be going east. Every afternoon they'd be going back to the Philippines. They go over there and drop their bomb load on Vietnam, turn around and go home. We went up the river to Saigon, spent Christmas of 1966 in Saigon, and one little story about that. Of course, we hadn't had mail since the Philippines, you know, maybe a month. We hadn't had mail, but when we got to Saigon, we got mail, and I had all these packages. Kind of interesting. So I opened these boxes, and chocolate chip cookies. And let me tell you, after they go on a U.S. mail and everything else from Easton, Pennsylvania to Saigon, they were chip cookies. But unbeknownst to me, my wife had put an ad in the paper, or not an ad, but one of these volunteer things. If you know a serviceman, et cetera, if you want to send him a Christmas card or a box of cookies or whatever. And I had any number of folks who sent me cookies, and I I would say if you're going to send something to a serviceman in Afghanistan or wherever he is, they're certainly appreciated. It was one of those things that was unexpected. I don't remember the cookies were good, bad, or indifferent, but it let you know that somebody really cared about what you were doing. It was, I really remember those things. We put Marines on the beach down in the Delta a couple times, did those things that we were supposed to do. I guess one of the things that I got most from being in Vietnam, we are so fortunate to be in the country that we are in. Those people in Vietnam, of course, being a Navy, being on the water, we saw a lot of boat people. And these people all lived on a boat 25 feet long, 5 feet wide, mom, pop, a couple kids, and they lived on that boat. Everything they owned was on that boat. We went up to Hong Kong, it was the same way up there. Those people, they slept on the boat, they cooked on the boat, all the bathroom facilities were on the boat. It's no wonder those folks had dysentery. That river was not the cleanest thing in the world, but you know, Mama-san be up forward, she'd take that big pot and she'd dip that water to cook rice or whatever. And everybody else was using that river for some other purpose. But they lived, you know, we're just so very fortunate to have what we have, and I don't think most people appreciate it. I probably don't appreciate it until you get another place and see some of that stuff. I guess one thing I think the military being there gives you some appreciation for the guys that are over there now, whatever they're doing. I remember when we were going up the Mekong, going to Saigon that first time, I had a kid came to me. He was a Seaman Deuce, had on his white t-shirt, had on his little Dixie cup, and he had taken two .30 caliber bandoliers. He had one over each shoulder. He had a .30 caliber air-cooled machine gun in his arms. And he's leaning back against the rail on the bridge. "Mr. Dexheimer, take my picture, take my picture. I want to send it to my mom and show her I'm in the war." It was like it was a game. Here's this kid 18 years old, and you know, he's out there where people are shooting at you and what have you. And he wanted his mom to know that he was out there in the war. It was the responsibility that we put on those young people is just amazing, and the way that they serve and the job that they do, and sometimes I think we don't give them proper credit. So anyway, after I was separated, we went up to Hong Kong sometime late January, early February. I got separated up there, flew home, and that's the end of the story. It goes on and on. You wonder, how am I going to do this interview and how will I fill that time? But, you know, like the fellow before me, I could sit here all day and tell some of those stories, and you remember the people. It's all about the people that you served with. Some were a little crazy. All good folks, though, out there just doing the best that they could. I spent 3.5 years active. Every skipper I had said, sailors belong on ships, ships belong at sea. And I, newlywed, you know, I didn't want to spend my whole life on the ocean. So it came time to get out. Of course, they, you know, like all good sailors and all good governments, they offered me, you know, gee whiz, if you'll augment and go regular Navy and re-up for another 4 years, we'll send you to shore duty in Japan like you've requested. Excuse me, Jack, but I got other plans now. You know, you should have asked me 6 months ago, maybe you had a shot, but I got 2 months on my tour to go, and I'm going back to Civland. So that's what I did. But some great people, and I enjoyed it. If I was single, I probably would have done 20, but being married, that just wasn't the way to go. Thank you very much.